Late last night, the WNBA responded to the players' last proposal with a counterproposal of their own. I think it's worth noting that the league, after waiting 2 6-week periods earlier in the negotiations, has sped things up, responding to the players' latest proposal in 48 hours or less than. But it does feel like both sides are jockeying over the term urgency. And I do think I have to give it to the union on the urgency front, because despite the quick response, the league's proposal offered only minimal concessions on revenue sharing, increasing the salary cap by $100,000 from $5.65 million to $5.75 million. But what I will say is the league did make a pretty significant move by accelerating the max contract eligibility for star players on rookie contracts. Here's what they did. So in this proposal, any player on the rookie deal who made an all WNBA team will be eligible to make a max contract, or about 17% of the cap, in their fourth season. As opposed to in the current CBA, you could extend in your fourth season, but the max would not kick in to your fifth season. Also, if you win an MVP award on your rookie deal, you're eligible for the Supermax in your fourth season, which is 20% of the cap. So far, no MVPs, no Candace Parkers yet, but you certainly have a few players in the running. Caitlin Clark is kind of perpetually in the MVP running when she's healthy. Aaliyah Boston was getting some buzz last year. Paige Beckers was getting some buzz last year. And those are three players that I think will be significantly impacted by this. We'll get into the implications that they would have for their teams a little bit later on the pod, and also add that this is on top of all rookie deals being prorated to about $500K. I think the WNBA was embarrassed about all the headlines about how much money Caitlin Clark makes on a yearly basis. So good on them to try to get ahead of that. But here's the catch overall on the WNBA's latest proposal. So the players' share of projected gross revenue under this proposal still remains under 15%. Another reminder that if you multiply the 5.75 million figure by 15 teams and calculate what 86% is 15% of, you figure out that the league's conservative revenue projection for 2026 is 575 million, which is to say, of course, people are fighting over percentage points. There's a lot of money coming in. According to sources close to the negotiations, the league added that $100,000 to the salary cap by shifting rather than adding money from their revenue sharing projections into their revenue sharing guarantee, and by making small movements of about 0.5% on expense credits in later years of the agreement. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are expense credits? And why did Union Vice President Kelsey Plum reference them in her unrivaled press conference today? So expense credits are the slice of the revenue the league will take under their current proposal before they share it with players. Why is it important that Kelsey Plum reference them? Now let's get into what she said. She said that achieving a revenue share system is something that the players have fought really hard for, and she considers it a significant win. And she adds, according to ESPN's Alexa Philippou, that even if the players agree to a net revenue sharing system, the goal could be to continue to negotiate the expense credits the league gets. That is certainly an option, but I do think that there is something significant, or at least noteworthy, about her publicly referencing expense credits and kind of wrapping her head around the idea of accepting the league's net revenue sharing system as a VP of the union. You get the sense that this is something that she has started to tacitly accept. She also is among the players on the executive committee who do not want to strike. Breanna Stewart is also among these players. As Plum put it herself, a strike would be the worst thing for both sides because we are in a revenue sharing system. So no revenue equals no revenue to share. Stewie then reiterated her point. I find it very interesting that this rhetoric is coming on the heels of the union's groundbreaking announcement that the WNBA hit its revenue target. This was first reported by Katie Barnes of ESPN, triggering $16 million in payments to WNBA players alongside the union paying out $9.25 million in group licensing revenue. That's a $25 million financial and symbolic victory, kind of coming at the perfect time if you're thinking about whether or not to strike. But it does sound like, based on reporting from Howard Megdal, that there are a lot of players and agents who were caught off guard by the $9.25 million in group licensing being available, asking questions like, wait, how much? And why did this take so long? With Megdal particularly pointing out the lack of payments after COVID-19 led to a delayed start to the season. The agents have since sort of like started their own collective. If you've been following the negotiations, I'm sure you saw that last week as well, where they've asked for a little bit more transparency and an ability to review the proposals that the WNBA gives to the union. This is kind of standard operating procedure when you get this late into a negotiation as well, especially given the time crunch that the league is under right now too. But I also wonder if maybe the agents felt like they were somewhat in the dark. Now the reality is there's reporting about the WNBA PA's group licensing agreement going all the way back to 2020. So it's not like the union was hiding this information. I would imagine that there wasn't enough money to go around before to raise the eyebrows of interested agents. But it is an interesting wrinkle. I think that it does kind of fascinate me that we're seeing this type of rhetoric come right now. And it does make me wonder if that's part of the reason that the owners gave out a proposal so quickly. Maybe they think that this is a moment of sort of like disharmony for the union. But I do think that this is kind of the type of thing where, you can kind of just wait it out, let it kick in for everybody that $25 million is on the way, and things will kind of smooth themselves over. I think that the degree to which the players are unified or not is something that's been in, conversations in the media, on social media for the last few weeks or so. And it got me thinking, well, what about the ownership side, and which owners are really driving the negotiations? I feel like the league has basically been dead stopped around the 5.5 to 5.7 million figure for essentially the last 3 months. We just haven't seen a lot of movement in the revenue sharing. Now, I think the league would say, well, we made most of our movement earlier on in negotiations. We went from $800,000 to max to a $1.3 million max, potentially going to $2 million. And I think that's definitely a reasonable contention on the league side of things. But I also don't believe that you make all of those concessions early on because you think that you're not going to have to make them later on. Like, there's a reason that things are dead stopped. And I think that a lot of different owners have a lot of different concerns, and owners aren't going to speak up about these things because the CBA fines can be hefty. But I'll say this. It is my strong belief that there are owners in the WNBA who would be willing to get far closer to the players' number than what has been reflected in the league's proposal. And my theory is that the league is protecting its small-pocketed owners at the expense of the middle-class players, the small-pocketed players that we'll talk about a little bit later. There are absolutely owners in my mind that could afford a 28%, a 25%, or a 22% gross revenue sharing system, right? But there are also those who can't and those who won't. And I won't name them by name, but I think if you're a WNBA fan, you know who they are. And, if you are anybody with a concerted interest in the WNBA, from the commissioner to the players to the fans, I think you have to ask yourself, do you really want the CBA agreement that's going to define what is becoming a golden age of basketball, with Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers, and now you have this college class coming in, Michaela Blakes, AZ Fudd, Juju Watkins. We are getting a train of generational players. This is something that Andrew Hobner talked about on his podcast that really got me thinking. Do you really want this era of the WNBA to be dictated by the owners who have the least amount of funds, the least amount of vision, the last to get on the practice facility train, the least amount of investment? Like, those are the owners that I think at this juncture are going to be holding the WNBA back from being able to fully self-actualize. I also want to talk about an aspect of the negotiations that are extremely important in the middle class of the league. So the league, as Annie Costabile reported, and I later confirmed, made no adjustments to its previous housing proposal, which, right now, as things stand, all players would get team provided housing in the first year of the new CBA. And in 2027, team provided housing would only be available to developmental players, the players that are also coming in on like the 7-day contracts, rookies, and players signed to the league minimum. Now, obviously, if you're a max player, this doesn't bother you so much, but what it does leave out is the large swath of middle-class players in this league who are, going to be needed to actually ratify a vote. So the union, right, in its last offer, asked teams to provide housing for all players in the first few years of the deal and take away housing later on in the deal for players that were making at least 75% of the maximum salary, which would then allow the middle-class players to continue to benefit from housing. Natasha Cloud spoke about this in Unrivaled today as well. And, she says she's kind of become a spokesperson for the middle class of the league. Like, she's been very outspoken about CBA negotiations overall. And, I think that there are certainly some people who have kind of balked at things she said about, Unrivaled being able to, overtake the WNBA and things like that. And, well, if you have critiques of Natasha Cloud, that's fair. But the one thing I will say is that she's been very consistent all along about standing up for a group of players who weren't really taken care of in the last CBA and aren't really being taken care of in this CBA. She plays in the New York market and how it would negatively impact her. Even if she does get a huge jump, a $200K jump in her salary, you basically end up paying a lot of that back for potential housing in the more expensive markets in the United States. I think one thing that her comments got me thinking about was really like, which faction of the league wants to strike and which wants to play? And, is there uniformity there amongst, salary structures or not? And I imagine it's a mixed bag, but I do find it fascinating, right? Like, is it the millionaire players who rely on the league for endorsements and, they already got their salary increase and they won't particularly be moved by more, but they do rely on endorsements and sponsorships that come from actually playing? Or is it going to be the middle class players for whom 5x raise the WNBA is offering feels life-changing until the housing aspect of it comes in, right? And I also want to add too that, this is a part of the league that is simultaneously kind of in a bind right now, where they're the least represented in the league's proposals, not the union's proposals. I want to make that clear. But they're also the block that would be most hurt by a work stoppage. And I think, in that context, I find it very interesting that Natasha Cloud is speaking up and, kind of, reiterating her support of the executive committee and saying things like, they prepared us to save our money for, 3 years. And telling players that the negotiation process could look like this. I do think it's an interesting that, this isn't like a max contract player who, and certainly somebody has more clout than your average middle class player, but this isn't somebody, who is a top 5 name in the WNBA by any means. So I do find it interesting that she's the one sort of reiterating that the players do need to continue to negotiate. And I do think that, Kelsey and Breanna Stewart also said the same thing. I think that they want to negotiate. I think that they just don't necessarily want to strike. But yeah, this is all, I think the squeeze is something that could also just have a lot of implications for teams going forward, right? Like, if you look at the Indiana Fever, for example, under the league's previous proposal, Caitlin Clark, Leah Boston would have split $1.1 million in salary. Kelsey Mitchell, would have made the Supermax, probably the 20% Supermax. And then the rest of the money could go to, the role players who would build out that team, right? I also want to add that according to a source with knowledge of the situation, there will be no limit on the amount of max extensions that a team can dole out. I guess as long as they meet the minimum roster requirement, which is currently 11, you can sign players to as many max contracts as you want to. So it won't be like, even right now, you can't really, there's a max on how many core players that you can have. Maybe there'll still be a max on core players, but as of now, you can sign as many max contracts as you want. So let's say you're the Fever, right? Under this current proposal, Aaliyah Boston is going to be eligible to make the max contract next year. She'll be able to make 17% of the salary cap. Kelsey Mitchell is eligible for a supermax at 20%. Caitlin Clark will be making about 9% of the cap. Basically, next year, if you're the Fever, you're looking at the filling out, the other 8 to 9 roster spots with 46% of your cap in 2027 and 54% next year. So you're already going to have to start contingency planning for it. And it just doesn't leave a lot of money for everybody else, right? If you're the New York Liberty and you want to dole out 3 supermaxes, that's 40% of the cap left for other players. So there is going to be a bit of a squeeze here. And I'm not even saying that this is inequitable, right? Because ultimately it is the rookies, it is Caitlin Clark, it is the superstars in this league that drive merchandising sales, that drive ticket sales, that drive this media deal and the amount of attention that the league is getting. They are the ones that are creating the most financial. They are the ones that are creating the most revenue. At the same time, you still need to ratify a CBA. And the vast majority of players, all of whom have a vote, are in that middle group.